I was watching a sermon by Matt Chandler, and he said something that really stuck with me. And what he said was that I wonder if we asked everyone in this church to have their thoughts displayed in front of the whole church to see, how many of you guys would actually sit here through the whole thing to watch it? And I think he was just emphasizing the reality of how depraved our thoughts are. And it really brought together the teaching of Jesus and the entire teaching of the Bible, which makes Christianity very different from other religions. Where I was surprised to find out in Islam, one of the main teachings is that you're good people at your core, which is the complete opposite of what we're taught in Christianity, right? Because the reason Jesus had to come and die for us is because we are so depraved. As Paul says in one of his letters, we all fall short of the glory of God. We're so depraved, we need Jesus to come and die for us. And it's a really difficult concept for people to understand. Like, even within Christianity, but particularly in the world, people struggle to understand. I was having a conversation with a friend last year he's not a Christian, but he's been curious. And he was like, why would I go to hell if, I'm a good person, I'm nice to people, I'm not evil, I'm not out here doing like really bad things. But just because I don't believe in Jesus, why will I go to hell? And I forgot what I said. I'm sure I said something along these lines, but I've thought about that since last year because I wasn't pursuing God as much as I have been this year. And if you ask me that right now, I'd have a whole thing for him. But the answer to that is that you're not a good person. Like, none of us are good people. And the Matt Chandler analogy that he gave nails it, right? Our thoughts are so depraved. How many of us would actually have our thoughts broadcasted to a room full of people, right? 100 people, 1,000 people, and would sit there and watch? I wouldn't. I have some depraved thoughts. I'm like, I do not want this broadcasted for everyone to see. And that was something that really, as I said, rounded everything up. And it ties in well with what Jesus said about it was Sermon on the Mount, where he raised the standard. As a Christian, the standard is raised. He was like, you've heard in the law it was preached that you should not murder, but I say to you, if you have been angry with a brother in your heart, you have committed murder, right? And you've said, do not commit adultery. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you lust over someone in your heart, you've committed adultery with them. And I heard someone say when I was watching some videos, some Christian videos, and they were saying that Sermon on the Mount was actually so far ahead of its time, and even today it's so far ahead of its time. It's mind blowing. But certainly when he came 2,000 years ago, it was so ahead of his time. Like, what do you mean? Thoughts aren't the same as like committing adultery, or anger isn't the same as murdering someone. But what Jesus was saying, one, he was definitely calling us to a higher standard, right, and highlighting this fact that we're not good people at our core. But what he's saying in this passage, and Jesus loved to use like extremes, like he loved to use parabola, no, hyperbole. Parabola is a graph. I don't know why I said that. He loved to use hyperbole. And you have to use like the most extreme versions, if your right arm causes you to sin, cut off your hand, or if your eye causes you to lust, gouge it out. Like, he loved to use extremes. But what he's saying in this case is that anger is a surface manifestation of not caring about someone's life, and murder is the ultimate carrying out of I don't care about your life, right? If you murder someone, you absolutely have no regard for their life. And if you're angry over someone, it's a surface manifestation of that. Similarly with lust and adultery. Again, adultery, you don't care about, somebody's reputation or their dignity, or you don't care about their dignity or their value as a child of God. And lusting is a surface manifestation of that, but it's still the same thing. And Jesus is calling us to a higher standard. And furthermore, he is highlighting this fact that this is why I have to come die for you. Like, to us Christians, he's saying this is why I need to come die for you, because even though you're not committing murder, you're not committing adultery, you're still committing surface manifestations of that. And again, that's the big thing Jesus came. When he came, the reason I had such a big problem with the Pharisees, and one of the main things he was teaching was that it's about your heart. You cannot trick God, right? He's saying, like, okay, you're following this law that's saying, okay, do not commit murder, do not commit adultery, and then there are all these other things. And the Pharisees were like following them, like they were following them to a T on the surface, right? They were making sure, like, in public, like they don't look that way, but their hearts were far from God. So using his example, they weren't committing adultery, but you'd have someone lusting in their heart, or they weren't committing murder, but they were angry and they had no sense of justice or mercy for other people. And Jesus is saying, no, you've missed the point of the law. The point of the law is about your heart. God wants your heart. These are things you're not supposed to be doing, but your heart, if you get to doing those things, your heart is utterly depraved. And he was saying that you guys have kept the law at the surface, but your heart is not in it. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. Now, I love this analogy that I've heard. I heard it twice in 1 week. A sermon by Matt Chandler and a sermon by John Bevere. And it was the concept of Christianity and how we're called to pursue sanctification. And sanctification is just a big word of, being made holy by God. And they were using the analogy of becoming a Christian being like a marriage. And Matt Chandler was saying, when I got married to my wife 20 years ago, she's not more my wife today than she was that day, right? So 20 years into the marriage, she's not more my wife today than she was that day. Like the day I married her, she was my wife, right? But when she became my wife, she was called to act differently. I wouldn't expect her to go out there, giving out her number to other guys, going on dates, flirting with other guys, like that sort of thing. I wouldn't expect her to start doing that now, because now she's my wife. She's in a covenant with me, and we're in a covenant with God, right? I expect her to act a certain way. Similarly, he was saying with me, when I married her 20 years ago, I'm not more her husband today than I was 20 years ago. But when I married her, I was called to start acting a certain way. I can't be going out, giving numbers to girls, going on dates, flirting with other girls. It was that analogy where it's like, when you're married, you've become her husband, right? That's not going to change now, right? Like, you are her husband. That's not going to change. And he was aligning that with becoming a Christian. So when you're saved, right? There's no changing that. You're saved, you're a child of God, and you're going to heaven, right? Provided you're truly saved. But once you become a Christian, you're called to act a certain way. Now, again, going back to the analogy, you acting like a husband, to what Matt Chandler is saying, you acting like a husband, so you doing the things, not going on dates, not giving out numbers to other women, doesn't make you more of a husband. And similarly, if you go out there and you don't do that, right? If you go out there and you're flirting with other girls, you're giving numbers to other women and all of that, it doesn't make you less her husband. Like, you're still her husband. Now, again, what does that say about the state of your marriage? And if you do that, probably you're not going to be a husband for much longer. But the analogy remains the same. You're still her husband, regardless of whether you do those things or you don't do those things. But because you're a husband, you're called to start acting like a husband and start doing those things. And that's a similar thing with our covenant with God. And it's so interesting that the Bible describes us as the bride and Jesus as the bridegroom, right? Like, we're in a covenant with God. Like, the church is Jesus is going to come back and marry the church, right? So interesting that they use that same analogy. And it's a similar thing with us Christians, where we're called to act a certain way. And I think that ties in so well with just realizing how when we're called to a higher standard, it just highlights, just how depraved we are as humans and how we need God. But yeah, thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Make sure you hit subscribe to join the community, and let me know what you think of the topic in the comment section below. Until next time, see you guys.